Continuation of Chapter 7. Liberty, our faculty to choose the means, while respecting the true order of ends. Our choice must be delimited by the end, and the ultimate end, beyond our particular purposes, was forever fixed for us by God. The final end of our life is the glory of God and the salvation of our souls. We have no right to use our freedom to stray from this end. We are free for a fixed end, and to choose between the means that lead us there. Do you wish to go to Rome? You have the right to choose between the different routes that lead to Rome, your final destination. But if in the midst of the journey you should decide to change trains and head to Amsterdam, you no longer have the same final destination, the fixed end. The morality of our acts is constituted by the fact of being oriented towards our final end, and the laws that have been given to us, the 10 Commandments, are like the wayside signs that indicate the route that leads to the end. It follows that the law is not made to limit our freedom, but to guide it. It is possible to choose the right way thanks to the laws, because they show us how to arrive at our end. This is what the liberals refuse to recognize. For them, if the goal is fixed, one is no longer free. Yet one must know what one wants, either to come to misfortune and eternal punishment, or else to attain the happiness that God has prepared for us if we use our liberty according to His will, the will that He placed in us, that is inscribed in our nature. Hence the importance of the encyclical Libertas, perhaps the only one in which the Pope has been determined to define liberty with entire precision, so as to refute all the errors of liberalism. Further on, he says, quote, "The real perfection of all creatures is found in the prosecution and attainment of their respective ends. But the supreme end to which human liberty must aspire is God." End quote. These are the things that people do not want to understand. All those who speak in favor of freedom are given audience, but those who speak of delimiting liberty are rebuffed. Liberty is a kind of mirage. All the electoral campaigns are made in its name, and people refuse to admit that the liberty to do evil leads to the ruin of society. One forgets why the good God gave us this power attached to the understanding and the will. It is because the reason can know the good and compare the means to reach the end to be attained, and having made the choice, to propose to the will to act in a way according to the principles of reason and faith. Law, a precious help to our liberty. And what helps us to use our liberty well? The law does. Pope Leo XIII explains, quote, "First of all, there must be law, that is, a fixed rule of teaching what is to be done and what is to be left undone. This rule cannot affect the lower animals in any true sense, since they act of necessity, following their natural instinct, and cannot of themselves act in any other way." End quote. It can be said in a certain way, analogously, The animals also have laws, but this refers to their instincts, which they follow blindly. They do not reflect, they are guided. Even the vegetable kingdom has its laws, those of germination, growth, flowering, and reproduction. That is because the good God created the plants for a fixed end, as he did the animals. He gave them laws inscribed in their nature, which they follow perfectly. A plant will never turn away from its law, unless it is impeded by an unnatural occurrence, for the seed is meant to germinate, and the sprout to grow. But as for men, the good Lord who created them endowed them with understanding, so that they could know their own law, which leads to the end, and which, with supernatural grace, guides them to eternal happiness. We shall attain this happiness in the measure that we apply our minds and wills to this law. It is, after all, incredible that those who possess intelligence, and thus knowledge of the law that governs them, should nonetheless do evil. On the contrary, they should follow this law with more perfection than the plants and animals do theirs. The good God has given us understanding in order to voluntarily put to work the powers he has placed in us, in order to attain the end prescribed for us. And shall we refuse to attain this end? At first sight, it would seem inconceivable that man should sin. Unfortunately, given his constitution and his effectively limited and imperfect knowledge, it is possible for him to become attached to apparent goods that, in fact, lead to death. The object of sin is a false good, a disordered good that is not directed to the end. Right reason is ordered to the end. For example, drink is good insofar as it is necessary for health, but someone who seeks to become drunk is acting in a disordered manner. He is heading for suicide. He no longer follows the law. It is the same for all the goods to which we become attached in a disordered way. They are all good, but only to a degree, and thus good only insofar as they lead us to the end, which has been established by God. Hence, everyone needs the law, which is summed up in the law of love. Love God and one's neighbor. Someone who ruins his health by drink, for example, harms his own family. He fails to love his family. What then is the definition of the law? Pope Leo XIII gives a definition. Quote, "The reason prescribes to the will what it should seek after or shun, in order to the eventual attainment of man's last end, for the sake of which all his actions ought to be performed. This ordination of reason is called law." End quote. It is the road sign on the route that we must follow. It is also what justifies the law. It makes it possible to distinguish between good and bad laws, those that direct our reason well, and those that do not. A bad law is not a law. It is no longer an ordinatio rationis, because it goes against reason. One must disobey it. We read, quote, "In man's free will, therefore, or in the moral necessity of our voluntary acts being in accordance with reason, lies the very root of the necessity of law. Nothing more foolish can be uttered or conceived than the notion that, because man is free by nature, he is therefore exempt from law. Were this the case, It would follow that to become free, we must be deprived of reason, whereas the truth is that we are bound to submit to law precisely because we are free by our very nature. For law is the guide of man's actions. It turns him towards good by its rewards, and deters him from evil by its punishments." End quote. Eternal law, natural law, human law. In this first part of the encyclical, the Pope applies himself to explain the reason for the law in relation to freedom. It is then that the distinction appears between the eternal law, the natural law, and human law. The natural law is that, quote, "which is written and engraved in the mind of every man, and this is nothing but our reason, commanding us to do right and forbidding sin." End quote. And human law is nothing else but the application of the natural law to society by the authorities. The Pope adds, quote, "Just as civil society did not create human nature, so neither can it be said to be the author of the good which befits human nature, or of the evil which is contrary to it. Law comes before men live together in society, and have their origin in the natural, and consequently in the eternal law." End quote. So the natural law depends intimately upon the eternal law, the law that is in God, the supreme legislator. Quote, "It follows, therefore, that the law of nature is the same thing as the eternal law, implanted in rational creatures and inclining them to their right action and end, and can be nothing else but the eternal reason of God, the creator and ruler of all the world." End quote. The necessity of human law. These considerations are very important because they establish the necessity of our obedience to law. The law isn't arbitrary. Footnote: Even the eternal law is not the decree of an arbitrary and obscure will, but the work of divine wisdom. The natural law isn't arbitrary since it corresponds to the good of our nature. Neither is human law, as it must be in conformity with the natural law. End footnote. The law isn't arbitrary. It must always correspond to the superior law, and consequently to the eternal law. Human laws, ecclesiastical laws, as well as those of the civil authority, must be in conformity with the law of the Creator, who made nature itself. This is what must guide our obedience. Quote, "For what reason and the natural law do for individuals, that human law, promulgated for their good, does for the citizens of states." End quote. But there are some enactments of the civil authority, quote, "which do not follow directly but somewhat remotely from the natural law, and decide many points which the law of nature treats only in a general and indefinite way. For instance, though nature commands all to contribute to the public peace and prosperity, whatever belongs to the manner and circumstances and condition under which such service is to be rendered must be determined by the wisdom of men and not by nature itself." End quote. Hence, there is a wide domain that must be specified by the authorities, whence the need of a civil code of law, as there is the code of canon law in the Church, which must always be in relation to the fundamental law, which is at once both the natural law and the eternal law. Human law can never prescribe things contrary to the eternal law. Quote, "Therefore, the true liberty of human society does not consist in every man doing what he pleases, for this would simply end in turmoil and confusion, and bring on the overthrow of the state, but rather in this, that through the injunctions of the civil law all may more easily conform to the prescriptions of the eternal law." End quote. Memorize this magnificent definition of moral liberty in society, what civil liberty consists in, and notice the necessary relation between civil law and the eternal law. Quote, "The liberty of those who are in authority does not consist in the power to lay unreasonable and capricious commands upon their subjects, which would equally be criminal and would lead to the ruin of the commonwealth. But the binding force of human laws is in this, that they are to be regarded as applications of the eternal law, and incapable of sanctioning anything which is not contained in the eternal law." End quote. This is what makes the force of civil laws. Quote, "If then by anyone in authority something be sanctioned out of conformity with the principles of right reason, and consequently hurtful to the commonwealth, such an enactment can have no binding force of law." End quote. It would not even be a law.